Good morning. This meeting of the Louisiana Tax Commission is hereby called to order. This meeting is being held at the offices of the Louisiana Tax Commission at 1051 North Third Street, Suite 225, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The date is Wednesday, July 19th, 2023, and the time is 10:01 a.m. Please call the roll.
Chairman Shahardi,
Here.
Commissioner Potier,
Here.
Commissioner Jeffers,
Here.
Commissioner Vercher,
Here.
Commissioner Wood,
Here.
5 present and a quorum.
Thank you. There being no old business, we'll get to the approval of the minutes. I'm going to move now that we defer approval of the minutes from July 12th, 2023 for both the rules and regulations session as well as for the open meeting. My motion is to defer approval of those minutes. Is there any objection to that motion? There being no objection to the motion stands adopted. We'll now move on to consideration of change orders.
Chandrika Banks, on behalf of the Louisiana Tax Commission, today we have a total of 698 change orders. Staff has reviewed those change orders and requests to approve 651 and place 47 in pending status. Staff requests approval of these change orders.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I would move that we accept staff recommendations and approve 651 change orders and place 47 in pending status.
All right, we have a motion. Is there any objection to the motion? There being no objection to the motion stands adopted. We'll now consider prior pending change orders.
Chandrika Banks, on behalf of the Louisiana Tax Commission, today we have a total of 72 prior pending change orders. Staff has reviewed those change orders and requests to approve 40 and leave 32 remaining in pending status. Staff requests approval of the prior pending change orders.
Do we have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we accept staff recommendations pertaining to the prior pending change orders, approve 40, place 32 back in pending status.
We have a motion. Is there any objection to the motion? There being no objection to the motion stands adopted. We'll now consider tax sale cancellations.
Chandrika Banks, on behalf of the Louisiana Tax Commission, today we have a total of 2 tax sale cancellations, 1 in Cattle Parish due to being erroneously sold, and 1 in Red River due to being erroneously sold. Staff requests approval of these tax sale cancellations.
We have a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of 2 tax sale cancellations based on staff's recommendation. 1 in Cattle Parish, 1 in Red River Parish.
We have a motion. Is there any objection to the motion? There being no objection to the motion stands adopted. We'll now move on to the appeal portion of our docket. We'll take up the appeal of Deepwater Supply, Inc. versus Assessor Wendy Thibodeau and the Lafourche Parish Board of Review. Docket number 22-22057-025. I'll ask anybody who is planning on testifying before the commission today to please stand up at your chair and to be sworn in as a witness.
Yes, Ryan Freeland.
Thank you. All right, this is a taxpayer appeal, so we'll ask you folks to please go ahead and start. And please say your name for the record. And also, please get that microphone close to your mouth so we can hear you.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Hall, here on behalf of Deepwater Supply.
My name is David Keddington, Vice President of Supply Chain Transocean, here for Deepwater Supply, Inc., which is a subsidiary of Transocean.
So we have submitted.
Please pull the microphone closer if you can. I'll just pull it closer.
Sure. We have submitted approximately 43 pages in support. A lot of it is ancillary information, exhibits, as of filings. But we have support in three different areas for the valuation that we're requesting. The first couple pages are the appeal filing exhibits and letters of authorization. The basis that we're requesting an evaluation is we're asking for the application of 70% obsolescence factor to be applied to the equipment located in Lafourche Parish for tax year 2022. It's the equipment that was there as of 1/1/2022. This obsolescence factor would reduce the market value of the assets from the current valuation of 23,287,867 to approximately 8,733,000,000. Wanted to provide a quick overview of the company and what the equipment is that's at this facility. So Deepwater Supply is a subsidiary of Transocean. So a lot of the information that we have in here is of Transocean. The Transocean is a leading international provider of offshore contract drilling services for oil and gas well services, or for oil and gas wells. As of February 14, 2022, Transocean Limited owned or had partial ownership interest and operated a fleet of 37 mobile offshore drilling units consisting of 27 ultra deepwater floaters and 10 harsh environment floaters. Transocean is a primary business, contract drilling services and single operating segment, which involves contracting our mobile offshore drilling rigs, related equipment, and work crews to drill oil and gas wells. Transocean specializes in technically demanding regions of the global offshore drilling business with a particular focus in ultra deepwater and harsh environmental drilling services. Transocean's drilling fleet is one of the most versatile fleets in the world, consisting of drill ships, semi-submersibles, floaters, in support of offshore drilling activities and offshore support services on a worldwide basis. Deepwater Supply equipment in Lafourche Parish consists of drill piping, riser joints, and other drilling equipment not currently in use, awaiting maintenance or use demand return service offshore. Deepwater Supply's equipment is not producing revenue when it's in Lafourche Parish. So the equipment that is in question that is being valued is in support of Deepwater Supply's overall business. David, give a little background on what this equipment is, the risers and.
Yeah, I think we went through this last year, so I'll be brief and hopefully jog some memories here, but there's really the two principal pieces of kit: marine drilling riser, which is a drill pipe. It's just a big piece of tube, about 21 inches, in diameter, that extends from the drilling vessel at the surface to the seafloor and connects to a BOP, and it serves as the conduit for drilling mud to go in between the reservoir and the drilling vessel. So those are those joints typically have buoyancy assigned to them, so that because they're very heavy and too much weight will pull down the vessel. So it's really consists again of a 21-inch pipe with some buoyancy, and it's pressure control related, so withstand up to 15,000 psi. So that's one. The drill pipe is just again what connects the drill bit all the way up to the rotary table. So when I'm drilling the well, spinning at the surface, the drill pipe goes down into the reservoir or down into the rock, has the drill bit on it, and again serves as a conduit for drilling mud coming down the drill pipe string, out the nozzles of the drill bit to help clear the cuttings and provide pressure control against the pressures in the rock formation. And then that fluid comes out the nozzles of the drill bit, circulates up the riser, and then gets cleaned more or less on the drilling vessel. So we have those kind of pipes. Sometimes when we're drilling wells, we don't need all the marine riser, so it normally stays on board the vessel, and then it will come on shore where it's preserved and stored until it needs to go back out to the rig, and we do that to maintain extra space on the rig. Same with the drill pipe. And sometimes we bring stuff into shore to be repaired as well too, and there's repair facilities as well in the parish. So that's essentially the essence of those operations. Now, in a world where we're oversupplied, which you'll see from some of the exhibits, then a lot of times that stuff will come onto shore and not go out back for use because there is no use for it at the moment. And so sometimes things will come into shore and sit there for a while, because there's no economic market for them at the time.
If you turn to page 5, the pages are numbered at the top right. This is an aerial of the facility. And so this was not necessarily as of 1/1/2022, but it gives an example. This is a staging area. There is not manufacturing that is going on here. There is not significant repair work. This is an area where the equipment, the risers are brought onto land and they are cleaned and they are waiting to go back offshore. So while they are at this facility, they are generating no revenue. They're not in use. We turn back to page 4.
And I just want to make one point.
Excuse
There
me
is
one
no
moment.
market for
You
marine
said the
riser.
equipment's not in use. It's not scrap. Am I correct?
No, it's not scrap. So it's
It's
being,
just waiting, it's just waiting to go offshore.
yeah, waiting to be redeployed. And just to be clear, there's
So how
no,
does that justify a 70% obsolescence?
okay, you want me to, well, we can get there, but
Well,
again,
that's that, I mean, when I reviewed everything, I
Yeah.
don't see any support for the granting of obsolescence.
okay.
So that's other commissioners may have other
Okay.
concerns.
Let me address that, because I think that's going to be the gist of this whole discussion is there's a cost method that's being deployed or being utilized for assessing the value of these goods, right? And so if you think about typical valuation methods, you have cost, you have income, and you have market comparables, okay? And so if you only use one of those methods and you don't try to calibrate those with the other methods, income and market comparables, then you could find yourself in a situation where the cost method does not actually represent the fair market value of the assets. And that's what happens when you get into a situation where you have a rental business that's massively oversupplied, which is what we saw again in 2021 and 2022. Because if these items have to stay onshore and there's no economic market for them, then they can generate no income. If they can generate no income, the market comparable for selling it becomes very, very low because there's no market for sale of it. And so that's in those cases, that's when the fair market value comes to be very low for drilling equipment, which is what we saw in those 2 years. And we'll present some additional information about that. And in that point, you have a disconnect between the cost method, which is what's utilized by the assessor, and what the true fair market value of the assets is.
That's all good and fine, but where does 70% come from?
Okay,
I mean, there's no engineering reports, unless I missed something, no engineering reports, no other reports giving that explanation. And from what I'm hearing, it sounds to me like this is equipment that is in use. It's just waiting to be physically used. In other words, if that equipment wasn't there and you needed it,
Mhm.
you'd have to go out and buy it.
Mhm.
Or go find it somewhere. So that doesn't mean that equipment is all but worthless.
and then the question is, what would you buy it for?
Well, my point is
Yeah.
that the equipment's sitting there, it's waiting to be used.
Mhm.
I'm trying to understand why that should receive 70% obsolescence.
Mhm. You want me to keep going, or you want to?
If you would allow, we have information through here for the different points of approaches to value, and hopefully we can go through those and
Okay.
and correlate to that
Sure.
number, if that'd be acceptable. So right now, the valuation that's being put in place is a cost approach. And so the cost approach is the numbers are coming from the LAT 5. We are in agreement on the costs that were put in there. The physical depreciation table is 2503D. It's an 8-year life that is being applied. And then the assessor has applied a 20% obsolescence. The 20% obsolescence is based on contract drilling revenues, comparing tax year or comparing 2020 and 2021. We believe that is too short of an area. And part of the review as far as additional obsolescence is broadening that view. So this equipment was purchased through different time periods. We have that on here. It was expected to generate a return, an ROA, and that return is not being generated, and that's part of the obsolescence that we wish to go through. And so right now, the obsolescence that is in place is just comparing 2 years. We believe it needs to compare significantly more years of data and income so that it shows what the true obsolescence is. And so that's what we wish to go through to show those measurements. So the idea that is put in place is we understand it's just the components that are going into that valuation that we have a disagreement with, from the 20% that's being placed right now to 70%, which we're requesting. So a lot of this is information from their annual report. And if we take a look, I'll skip the overview, I'll skip the information, as you seem to have an idea on what that's about. But if we look on page 8, this is from their annual report, and it speaks to the status of their equipment. Again, if the rigs are not in use, they're not generating income. So this speaks to, we can see here on the right-hand side of the table where the rigs are, and this is for ultra deep water floaters. We have US Gulf Coast, we have stacked, and we have different locations across the world, but stacked or idled is 13 out of the 27 floaters that they have, ultra deep water floaters. So 13 of their units are not in use and not generating income. Do you want to speak a little bit regarding stacked versus idle? And
yeah, we don't need to talk a lot about it, but stacked just means it's not available for immediate use. It's being preserved for a market upturn. So the market doesn't demand 27 vessels, it only demands 14. And so those 13 have no work to do.
The stacked, I know we had conversation
Yeah.
about this before. There are some intricate differences between
Yes.
something that's stacked and idle.
Yes, they're partially seaworthy, but not ready to go back for immediate use. You'd have to reactivate them, remove all the preservation that's been done, overhaul some of the equipment. So you'd have to spend some money to get it back into service. Yes. Okay.
Pages 14 and 15. Again, from the annual report, they speak to the risks related to the business and the significant competition that's in place. And so I won't go through all these, but being from Louisiana, you're all well aware of the oil and gas industry, what it was versus where it was as of 1/1/2022. So we have significant comparisons in here dating the years past, which goes into our obsolescence reviews. But this is speaking directly to the risks that this company takes on as part of this review. So you want to speak to on page 16, is a comparison of share price index.
Yeah, I just jump into the spreadsheet.
We certainly can then do the next step. Yeah.
Let me just jump into the spreadsheet, because I think the spreadsheet is where, if you look at, I've got a spreadsheet of day rates. Yeah, page 17. Okay, day rates, fair market value, and comparisons. Because I think to me, I've been in this space for 20 years. And so to me, this is the simplest way I could think of to kind of explain the differences between the 3 different methods of valuation: cost, market comparables, and income approach, and try to explain why there's a disconnect that we're talking about 70% obsolescence on the cost approach between what we believe the cost approach is generating and what the fair market value of the assets is. Okay. And so I'm going to just be transparent here. I don't know that the assessors have the information necessary to value assets on any method other than the cost approach. So it's not a critique against them. I don't think that they're given that information. They're looking to us to provide the justification for what the obsolescence factor. But when you have a cost approach that doesn't get you close to what the true fair market value is, then you need to be willing to consider the other information out there. And so you ask the question, okay, let's say I have a drill ship, it costs $1 million. That's what the cost of it is to build. But let's say I can go out and buy the same one for $300,000. The fair market value of that drill ship is only $300,000, because that's all I could sell it for today if I went out to try and sell it. Even though I built it for $1 million, I can only sell it for 300,000 because that's what the market is. And so the only way to go from a cost approach to the fair market value under those circumstances is to apply an obsolescence, call it an economic obsolescence, whatever type of obsolescence you want to apply to it, is 70%. And this is really what we were seeing in 2021 and 2022 when you had a massively oversupplied drilling market, is there weren't jobs for all these drilling rigs. So the cost approach works very well in a situation where you have a steady flow of assets coming into the market and a steady flow of assets coming out of a market, because the cost approach is what you pay to replace those assets. But when you're not in a market where assets are being replaced and there's a steady flow in and out of them, then it doesn't work. And that's really what we see here. So you can see that I've got the GOM, which is the Gulf of Mexico rig counts in columns D and E. And you can see in 2023 to 2022, what happens, okay? We start off in 2013 with a growing market.
Which page are you on?
Sorry.
Which page are you on?
17, sorry, okay.
Page 17?
Yeah, it looks like a spreadsheet like this. I don't know if you can see this from far. Okay. So in 2013, this is again, kind of when rigs were being constructed and delivered between 2013 and 2016. That's when you had a cost approach that was representing the cost of the fair market value assets. So you can see between semi-submersibles and drill ships, you've got 40 rigs working in the Gulf of Mexico in the ultra deep water space. Okay, move forward, 48 in 14, 46 and 15, and all of a sudden I'm dropped to 35 and 16. And this is again when oil starts to take a big downturn. Now I'm at 24 and 17, 23 and 18, 23 and 19, 20 in 2020, okay, 18 to 19 in 2021, and back to 22, let's say, in 2022. And so all that capital that for that 40 rigs is still not back and redeployed as of 2022, okay? And so there's basically 18 rigs worth of kit and equipment sitting around with nothing to do, not generating any income. And that's why the cost approach doesn't work. So if you take a look at the fair market value, and so there's all sorts of bankers and there's all sorts of consultants who broker in rigs. They sell rigs, they buy rigs, they sell them to other people. So what we've done is prepared a list, and Fernley Offshore is a tab here where you see current implied steel value, net of backlog NPV for every year. And let's see what, that's the try to start, yeah, start at page 20. So these guys put forward a report every week saying what the implied steel value of a rig is. And they're saying this is what a rig would be worth if you tried to sell it on the market today. And the way they come to this value is they basically say the value of the entire company that owns all these rigs is worth a certain amount as traded on the market. So these are all publicly traded drilling companies. So they have a market cap, they have publicly traded debt. You add the two together, that's the sum of its enterprise value. And the enterprise value is, for lack of a better explanation, the right side of the balance sheet, and then assets are on the left side of the balance sheet. And the sum of the assets should be, in most cases, equal to the sum of the enterprise value. And so you back into what these values say, and they're basically saying, okay, this is what a drill ship is worth if you were to buy the entire company that owns all these drill ships. And this is what a semi-submersible is worth if you were to buy all the semi-submersibles in that company. And so you can see between 2013 all the way to 2022 how these values continue to decline. And that's just a factor of the market being oversupplied. Okay. And so you can see that the fair market value is of these things is only, you know, in some cases for drill ships in 2022, $150 million. So what does it cost to build a drill ship? It costs close to $750 million. But it means I can go out and buy one because the market's oversupplied for $150 million. And that's where you start to get into these big obsolescence figures because the market does not support building any rigs, which is why nobody's built a rig in a long time, because you can't build a rig and make your money back. And you can go buy a rig for a fifth of what you could build a rig. And that's the big disconnect that we're talking about between the cost approach and the fair market value of assets. Now, if I go to the next columns, I've got day rates and I've got margins. So these day rates come from, these are average day rates from ODS Petrodata or IHS Petrodata. IHS is a big energy consulting company. They track all the fixtures, which we call new contracts for drilling rigs, what the day rate is for those. So this is all publicly available information. It's tracked in a number of different sources. Anybody can access it. And you can see, again, in 2013, the average day rate for a Gulf of Mexico ultra deep water rig was about $590,000. Then you see it decline all the way into 2018. So new fixtures were being signed at $150,000. So they've declined, by 75% all the way through to 2021. And then in 2022, the average day rate was 320. So it's starting to pick back up again. So the operating cost of a rig, and we're going to use for this example, is $150,000 a day. These are big rigs. They employ, a couple hundred people. They have lots of operating costs, fuel consumption, maintenance, all those kind of things. So at $150,000 a day operating and a day rate of $150K a day, $150,000 a day, you're making no money. So on the income approach, you're generating zero income for your shareholders. You're just trying to keep your rig busy so that it doesn't go to stack, because in stack, it starts to decline in value a bit more. And so you can see again on the, what I've done here in column L, the margin index, is I've taken that 170, whatever the margin is, so day rate minus $150,000 a day, gets you to the average margin here, and divided the margin by the margin that we were making in 2013 to tell you where we sit on the in terms of a margin index. So if 2013 represents a full cost method where cost is an accurate methodology, the margin that you make is 40% less. So that would imply at least a 60% obsolescence factor against a fully valued drill ship on the cost methodology. Okay. And so the point of this is basically to say what I can buy an asset for goes from 100% of cost in 2014 and 2013. This is column H, FMV divided by LTC, down to 20% to 13%. Okay, and then on the average margin, I'm making 100%, and it drops all the way to 40%. So the reason we're talking about a 70% obsolescence is because of those two methodologies, which I'd call what I can buy, the fair market value, what I can transact, what I can buy a vessel for in the market, and what it can earn. So the income approach and the market comparable approach puts me somewhere around 20 to 40% of fully valued, or 60 to 80% obsolescence factor based on market comparables. And the other exhibit we submitted, which we can talk about, is our asset sales of loose equipment. So that's what a rig earns, and the equipment that supports that rig can't earn more or can't be more valuable than the rig itself. And so when we try to sell loose equipment, and we've supplied to you 3 pages of market comparable sales, starting on page 26, when we try to sell this stuff in the open market as individual pieces of equipment, we typically only get 3 to 5% of its cost and that's again because there's an excess amount of equipment. So this phenomenon of having a gross excess of equipment and having obsolescence factors that are very high only continues as long as the market is undersupplied. Okay. Once the market comes back into supply and demand balance, the cost methodology starts to work again. And that's what we're going to start seeing now in 2023 and 2024, where market is coming back into balance and day rates are going back up. So we just signed another fixture for a contract for a start in 2024 that puts the day rate at 480. And so that will get us back into incomes that are more appropriate and fair market values that are more appropriate in the coming years. But for this brief period of time, which again was 2021, 2022, 2020, when oil was severely depressed and the market was massively oversupplied of vessels, that's why you have high obsolescence factors. And I realize I've blown through a whole bunch of numbers very fast. I apologize for that. But
where does that estimated original purchase come from?
Of a rig? Okay, so this is all equipment that we bought to support the rigs when we built the rigs. So again, when you're building rigs, it's because the market supports building rigs. The income that you can generate supports building the rigs. So that is, again, that's the cost, and the cost hasn't changed a lot to build this stuff. The cost remains fairly fixed. I mean, there's that we've included a purchase price index in here, but the cost to build things, remains fairly fixed, the cost of raw materials. But again, the point is that the cost becomes disconnected from the fair market value of assets when you're massively oversupplied in a rental market.
The original data that he was going through, that David was going through, was the industry overall, as far as the income, the day rates, and the margin. Page 26, 27, the sales, they are Deepwater Supplies Transocean's actual sales. That is their actual sales from their equipment, a similar equipment. And so that's why we thought it was so important to include this, because this is from 2019 sales, 2020 sales, and then page 27 is 2021 sales of this type of equipment. And whenever we're looking at it, the current assessment is 29% of original cost. So the current assessment that's on the rolls is 29% of original cost. These sales from 2019, 2020, and 2021 are 3.6% of original cost. That's part of seeing that disconnect of what we're being assessed versus the sales of this actual equipment. So we're trying to marry up the cost approach with the income approach and the sales approach in the three different approaches to value is what we're attempting to do with providing this information. One of the I know there's a lot of information that was provided, but one of the items that I want to.
And the reason I'm asking that question, this is all equipment that your company has sold. It's not an index of equipment that's sold by 10 companies like you. And I don't know that there are 10 companies, operators like you. I understand that there's not a big supply of this equipment, nor is there a big group of buyers. But you would think that your list would indicate more than just your company that's selling this particular piece of equipment. I got the Scorpion's name in your line.
Yeah.
I know they're probably small.
Yes. Most of the time we'll sell to brokers who try to on-sell to other people. Oh, sorry. Most of the time we'll sell to brokers who try to
So wouldn't you think that's more of a distress type of sale, not a true arm's length transaction?
It's an arm's length transaction because the market's distressed. Okay, so when the market's that oversupplied, like you said, there's not buyers because somebody can't buy it and immediately put it to work. So it's about guys. So guys are speculating to some degree, or there's a niche product that they're saying, okay, I'm going to buy this today and I'm going to hold on to it, or all right, I have a need for this drill pipe today because I don't have one, so I'll try and buy it from Transocean. But that is kind of the market conditions that we're talking about in this time frame of 2019 to 2020. There's not a lot of market comparables for individual sales. There's some, but that's why we've tried to provide what the value of the rig itself is. And you can see again, from the Fernley Offshore, there's all the different companies that are publicly traded. So you're looking at Diamond, you're looking at Valaris, Drillco was Maersk, you're looking at Noble, Pacific Drilling, you're looking at Transocean. Everybody who's got a publicly traded value shows up on this. And to the far right of those things, you have Norwegian drillers, which always aren't best comparable. They're not always the best comparables because they trade in a different currency on a different exchange. But for US based drillers, they're all there. And so you're saying, it's showing what those rigs are worth. And so again, significantly less than the cost.
So a company is going to come in and buy this with the expectation of making money with it to generate a return. And so on page 25, this is S&P Capital IQ, and this is different financial ratios for Transocean, but for the industry. And if we look, the profitability, return on assets, and this is for it says of December 2014, December 2015, December 2016, all the way through December 21. and the return on assets was negative 0.1%. So he's talking about the distressed market. There is not a market that somebody's coming in and buying this and able to generate income. So they're buying these assets, and David's talked about it being speculative, perhaps, but the industry is not making money. They're not generating return on these assets. And so this right here is an indicator. So back in December of 2015, they were getting a return of 5.7%. In December of 2014 is 5.6%. But as of December of 2021, this assessment date, it is negative 0.1% of return on assets.
Yeah, and just to add to that, of all the publicly traded companies, all of them went bankrupt except for Transocean. So the ones that remain, so if you go back a few years, you had Pacific Drilling, they've been acquired. Rowan Drilling, been acquired. Maersk Drilling, been acquired. Ensco went bankrupt, became Valaris. Diamond went bankrupt. Noble went bankrupt. So Transocean was the only one that didn't go bankrupt, but everybody else did, and that's the indication that there was severe distress in the market. So everybody who was the competitors back in 2014, 2015 has been acquired or went bankrupt. And again, this is a unique situation. So normally the cost method's going to work just fine, but in these few years, it was a very unique situation due to the massive oversupply and the bankruptcies in the market. It was a complete cratering of the offshore drilling market. And that's the reason we're here, is just for these particular years, there's a disconnect between cost and fair market value.
I have a few questions if
Sure.
you don't mind.
Mhm.
So on the fact that the equipment isn't generating revenue, is it booked as inventory?
No, this is booked as capital equipment. So,
And so on page 17, you have the average day rate. Is that day rate the average for just the Gulf area? And is that taking like an average and considering that all the rigs, contracts, and locations in the Gulf area are exactly equal? And are they?
So the way I've tried to pull these day rate figures is to pull them for a specific class of rigs, ultra deep water rigs. So rigs that can work in very deep waters in the Gulf of Mexico. And the day rates represent new fixtures. So these are so you might sign again, and I don't want to make this any more complicated than it needs to be. You might sign a day rate contract in 2017 that starts 6 months later because the rig has to get, so you may actually start to earn that day rate not until 2018. But the market is what the rate is when you sign the contract. So again, these are signed in that year for the Gulf of Mexico for ultra deep water rigs. So largely equivalent competitive classes.
So it's not just for the Gulf rigs, it's actually taking a class of rigs and
In the Gulf.
in the Gulf, okay.
Mhm.
And the day rate would not be the actual day rate that you're getting on these now, it's the current day rate that you would get.
Yeah, it's what you can get a customer to sign on a piece of contract. Or a contract. So we call that the fixture rate, because you're fixing the rate at that point in time. Okay, so typically, in a very tight market where you've got supply and demand imbalance, customers will take a longer term view because they don't want to find themselves without a rig. Because they know that if I don't sign up for this for 2 to 3 years, I may not be able to complete my drilling program and then have to go look for another rig. So in a tighter market, they'll take 2 to 3 year time durations for their contracts. In a weak market, they may take 6 months or 2 wells. And 2 wells would be the equivalent again of 6 months, maybe 90 days a well, 60 to 90 days per well. So again, in these bad markets where the day rate is very low, the fixtures are typically pretty short. And then when the market rises, the fixtures become longer.
And on page 17, on issue number 9, it says for market value estimates, the market value of publicly traded drillers should be divided by the number of rigs. Are all rigs, contracts, and locations equal? Can you actually make it that simple of a division?
Okay, so yeah, so it's not quite that simple, but yes. So what they do is and I don't know how, if you want me to get into the details of this, 'cause I've done a lot of this, but what you do is you have a value of the contract, and from a purchase price accounting, let's say I was to go buy a company, I would calculate the value of the contract, and then I'd have the steel value of the assets, right? And so what these guys do is they back out the value of the contract, and then they basically do exactly what you said, take the market value minus the contracts, divide it by the number of rigs. And that's your best average. So I take the sum of the market values of the debt, sum of the market cap, add them together, subtract out the contract value, and then divide it by the number of rigs.
All right.
Again, but they
let
try to
me
apportion
me
it to-
just
yeah.
ask this real quick. So they start by taking the value of each contract divided by the steel value of each asset, and then combine those for the market value of all the combined assets.
No, so you're gonna start with the market value of the company. So I'm gonna take market cap. I'm gonna add the market value of the debt, because a lot of these guys had a lot of debt. That's why they went bankrupt. Add those two together, I get enterprise value. That's the sum, that's the value of all the fair market value of all the assets in the company, more or less. Then I'm gonna subtract out the contract values. And the contract, so if it's 6 months and it's above market contract, it's gonna be an asset. If it's a below market contract, it's gonna be a liability. I subtract those out, and then what's left is my steel value, and I divide steel value by the number of rigs. Okay.
And we may be asking a lot of questions, but, and you say, I don't want to burden you with the details,
Yeah,
but you're at 70%, they're at 20%.
yes.
Okay, so
There's a lot of details.
there's a lot of details that somebody's missing somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, like I said, I'm not trying to critique they don't have the guide. They're not getting the guidance to do this. I mean, if you go to what comes out in terms of guidelines, and I did put this in spreadsheet page 17, the only data they're getting about offshore assets is what the replacement cost of a semi-submersible is anticipated to be. And so I put that in these columns B and C LTC guidelines, and that's all the guidance they get. So it's not a critique. It's just that
Was all this information provided to the assessor's office?
we provided.
A good portion of it, I wouldn't say
Well, a
all
good
of it,
portion.
100%, no, but a
All
good
right, well,
portion
a
of it.
good portion isn't enough. My question is, what was provided to the assessor's office?
Significant amounts of this was provided.
And specifically,
I'd have to go through and make a comparison. The question has come up several times. What's the difference between the 20% and the 70%? And I can show you where that came from. So there's an understanding on what we're looking at. If we look on page 24. This is an attempt to compare, this was provided, this was an attempt to compare different measurements. One being the rig utilization, and all this information came from their annual report. So we have rig utilization, we have return on assets, we have operating days, and drilling revenue. And so what we're showing is for each of the years, the highest amount for each of these years versus the actual for each of these years. So we can see here how it was determined, the 20% was determined, was based on drilling revenue. And so we can see here in 2014, the drilling revenue was 8.952, and that's the high. And then we compare it for 2015, it went down to 6.802, 2016, 3.705, all the way over to 2021. So 2021 was 2.556. This is again from their annual report. The 20% was determined by taking the 2020 versus the 2021, dividing the 2.556 versus the 3.152. And it came to 19% and rounded up to 20. What we're asking, again, is for it to be broadened and taking a look at many years of data, many years of drilling revenue, and instead of just being compared versus the one prior year, because the assets weren't just purchased in the prior year, the assets were purchased many years over, and taking into account whenever they purchased these assets, what was the expected return? What were they obtaining at that point? And comparing the 2.556 versus the 2014 8.952. So whenever these assets were purchased, they were generating significantly amounts of more drilling revenue versus 2021. And so we're asking for that to be taken into account instead of just 2020 versus 2021. That's where the 20% is coming from. That's the assessor's review to determine the 20% for obsolescence. We're saying there's significantly more information that needs to be taken into account instead of just the 2 prior years.
Were these rigs in the Gulf that are the subject of this hearing all purchased in 2014?
The assets that are at issue that are being valued here, if we turn to page 43. And this is a summary of the costs and how we come to our value. But the fourth column over, it's percent of total cost. So we have a total cost of 79,251,810. And then on the fourth column, percent of total cost is when those purchases were made. So the percentage of the overall total.
Let me just add something to that. So we ordered rigs between 2006 and 2014 was the last rig we ordered. Now there's a delay between when you order a rig and when it arrives. So that rig, that can be 3 years. The last 2 vessels that we ordered in 2014, we did not take delivery of until this year, which is 8 years later, 9 years later. And that's because we couldn't make money with them. So we left them in the shipyard and delayed the completion of those vessels, working through many contract extensions with the shipyard to only bring those out when they can generate income. And that's now. So again, those rigs are starting up in the Gulf of Mexico now.
So does the same relationship between the, that you may get a low contract rate and a low market work for those drilling rigs? Were they renegotiated in price or anything like that? Or was that the exact price that y'all had?
Yeah, the problem is you can't renegotiate the purchase price down to reflect that because the cost of the raw materials, the labor to build them is just what it is. So if you negotiate it down, the shipyard loses way too much money and they just say, I'm not doing it. Now, if the shipyard's completed the rig and it's sitting and somebody defaulted on it, which is something else that happened, then you can go in and try to buy those vessels and you're going to buy them for $250 million. And the original order price was closer to 750. Now, again, that was 2021, 2022. Things are changing now. Like I said, we just took delivery of our ships that we ordered in 2014.
The ship that was ordered in 2014 that you just received, was there any upcharges? Did they live up to the 2014 prices?
Yeah, so we signed a turnkey contract and then we had to pay them to delay. So there were change orders that upped the price. So the final delivery price was closer to $1 billion. And again, you would not be able to sell that for $1 billion today, but we honored our contract and they honored theirs.
So page 24 that we were talking, that is the best attempt to try to put all this into or the different measurements into a table that we can see year to year to year the differences on some of the big measurements. So all this is Transocean specific. This is from their annual reports. A lot of the support data that's behind here is just to support where this information came from. But the biggest issue there is the drilling revenue. And again, attempt is to correlate all 3 approaches to value. We have the cost approach that's been put into place, but the obsolescence that's been allowed is not marrying up, is not fully taking into account the income, the significant decrease in the income, and the significant low purchases that, that have been applied for this equipment. Or that have been obtained for 2019, 2021. Cents on the dollar. Again, one of the big things we hit earlier, right now, the assessment is 29% of original cost. And those sales are in the 3% range of original cost for this specific equipment that is on the site. Or the specific type of equipment.
Again, the 70% obsolescence. Specifically, where does that come from?
The-
What's the bottom line of where the 70% comes from?
So if we're looking on page 24, again, we have operating days. The operating days for 2021 was 7.236 versus 2014. The high was 21.893. That's a 67% reduction. The drilling revenue, which we spoke of, which is what the assessor's office is using comparison. Now, again, they're only comparing 2020 versus 2021. But if we look at the contract drilling revenue for 2021 of 2.556, and we compare that to 2014 of
I'm sorry,
8.952.
repeat that last statement.
2021 was 2.556. The 2014 was 8.952. That's a 71% reduction. And then also taking into account the sales, which were 3% of cost.
Could you explain the throughput scale factors?
Mhm. So the throughput scale factors is part of, it's from the ASA, value machinery and equipment, and I did bring the book this time. But what it's attempting to do is to understand it's not a dollar for dollar decrease. And so the throughput factor is trying to say there's going to be some cost no matter what. And so a drop in revenue is not a dollar for dollar drop, and it's trying to measure that and take into an understanding of here's what it has produced whenever it's going at full speed. And we used an actual production as full speed, 2014, compared to what it did produce at the latest assessment date, and measuring those across. So as you can see, we did weight at the bottom. We weighted 2020 and 2021 as 20%, and then for the drilling revenue, and then the other years is 10%. And we took those measurements. And so that throughput factor is trying to scale that where it's not a dollar for dollar, but it's from the American Society of Appraisers, valuing machinery and equipment, and how they direct to do it. And I do have the book.
And the scale factor, because you have two factors there. You had the throughput factor and then you have a scale factor.
The throughput factor is just a factor of dividing the weighted average production of 4,004 divided by the weighted average capability. Correct. And then the scale factor is at 0.6. It's trying to take into account that it's not a dollar for dollar reduction. Because there are going to be some soft costs that don't change just because of a reduction.
Did you have any actual meetings with the assessor to walk through the length of time that you've chosen to come up with your obsolescence factor?
We did travel to the assessor's office and met with Assessor Thibodeau and went through these reviews. Attempted to go through these reviews. It was in December of, I believe it was November or December of 22. We traveled to the assessor's office and spoke with him.
we'll hear from the assessor in a little bit. I was just trying to, view it from an assessor standpoint on the time frame you chose to go back and look at
Mhm.
versus, okay, we know the market is improving.
Mhm.
We know our day rates are going up. We're signing new contracts. So that equipment that's sitting there at that point in time that it's being assessed, it seems to me would be more valuable than it would have been 5 years ago, or definitely last year or the year before. So how was those years chosen in relation to the value that it is the day it's sitting on the yard?
Mhm. So the review was done, trying to take a look at is whenever it was purchased and whenever that decision was made to make those purchases of the assets. And so that's how we went back and took a look. Okay, let's take a look at the broad period of time. When were these assets purchased? And so there's the physical wear and tear that if they're in use, but if they're not in use, like I said, somebody's only going to purchase this to make money. And if they're not making money from it, or if they're not making the same amount as what they were in prior periods, then it's not going to have the same value. The value is going to be reduced. So that was how the time period was determined. Let's take a look when these assets were purchased, these assets that are being assessed. And let's try to understand when the decision was to purchase these assets, when those purchases were actually obtained, and then apply what was
All the assets were purchased in 2014?
no, on the last page, page 43. It goes through and speaks to when the assets, so the current cost in the acquisition year. So in 2014, there was 14,172,329 of expenditures for this equipment. So that's 20% of the total cost. And then in 2016, there was 36,883,262. So that's 52% of the cost.
And those are the years that we took delivery of the equipment. So we would order the equipment, like we said, between 2012 and 2014. It's a couple of years, gets delivered, take possession of it, begin operations.
So trying to determine what the expected return was whenever the purchase was made and acquired. And this is the different time periods where all those costs were acquired. So that's why we're saying, just looking at the last 2 years, we can look here in 2020, there's only 3% of their total cost that was acquired because they were not generating a return. In 2019, it was 14,000. So I mean, very little to no asset purchases during these years because there was no return. So just looking at the prior 2 years, we just don't think it's enough. And that's why we took a look back at the extended time period to when these assets were actually purchased.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any additional questions? Hi, Mr. Addington, do you have any questions?
I do. Mr. Caddington, first, we kind of skipped over the who you are.
Okay.
Uh,
Sure. Do you want me to reintroduce?
yeah.
Okay.
Could
Starting
you-
over, sorry. So,
No, literally reintroduce you, who you're employed by, and what your position is.
okay, so I'm Vice President of Supply Chain at Transocean. Transocean's a publicly traded company, NYSE rig. So, been with Transocean for 17 years and was with Shell 3 years before that in New Orleans. And so Houston based, worked in a couple of places around the world.
Perfect. That
Okay.
we'll all need it. Now, who is Deepwater Supply Inc.?
It's a 100% owned subsidiary of Transocean.
And is Deepwater Supply Inc. the same company that was formerly known as Resource Rigs?
Correct.
And when, it was just a name change or a corporate
Yes.
reorganization?
We had two entities, which was a result of legacy acquisitions.
Okay.
And then we combined those two entities and renamed it Deepwater Supply Inc.
Okay, are there other subsidiaries of Transocean other than Deepwater Supply Inc.?
That do this work or generally we
No, no,
have
just-
hundreds of subsidiaries. Yes.
There are hundreds of subsidiaries.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm. We
Well,
work
let's
in,
go-
we
let's
work
go
in,
back
we
to-
work in regions all around the world. So we have operating entities, rig owning entities all around the world.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, it's back in 2020, Resource Rig had requested an obsolescence reduction. It had submitted, you know, the same financial information, copies of Transocean's 10K and an appraisal. In 2020, did the assessor grant an obsolescence reduction to, at that time, Resource Rig?
I would have to go back and look, but we were here last time too. You should
Well,
remember, yes,
Sure, you say we were here.
yeah,
I will tell you, the record reflect that they granted a zero.
yes,
They granted no obsolescence reduction, and you appealed that to the tax commission, did you not?
we did.
And do you recall the outcome of those proceedings?
Is that relevant to today's discussion?
I get to ask.
Well, we were not granted it in 2020, so.
Okay. In 2021,
But I would assume you have to take each year as it comes.
you do,
Okay, all right.
2021.
Mhm.
I understand that this property, the same property was reported as being located in a federal trade zone in Terrebonne Parish, correct?
Well, some of the equipment we moved out of Lafourche to another place, yes.
Now, was it
Mhm.
physically moved or was it,
Physically moved, yes.
and then you moved it back to Lafourche Parish?
Okay, so are you is there a specific one you're referring to?
Well, I'm just asking
Mhm.
because I do kind of get lost that, you know, there was ultimately an assessment, but it was canceled out because the equipment was for 2021, the equipment was reported as all.
So
been
we maintain,
Terrebonne, and then it
Yes.
was back in Lafourche for 2022.
well, I don't know that it was back in Lafourche for 2022. Do you have a specific one that you want to reference?
The property listed on your renditions as being located. in
Some of
Lafourche
it never
Parish.
moved. It doesn't all move. We operate different facilities. So we have one in Lafourche and we have one in Terrebonne. So some stuff we moved out of Lafourche to Terrebonne.
But-
And we have a yard in Terrebonne where we have a very good supplier that works for us. And they have stuff there and it doesn't always go back and forth.
Did any of that equipment, any of it, move back to Lafourche?
Look, I don't, you're
22?
insinuating it does. Do you have an example?
No, I'm not insinuating anything. I'm literally trying to.
Because
figure
I
out
don't,
why we
I
have-
would have to go back and look, but I don't think that we typically do that. I think we move stuff to where, you know, we have the right operating profile. We moved some stuff out of Lafourche. It's in Terrebonne now and it operates out of Terrebonne.
Okay,
Mhm.
that's all.
Mhm.
So for
Mhm.
2022,
Mhm.
you submitted 10K information for Transocean.
Mhm.
Did you submit any financials for Deepwater Supply Inc.?
So as Andrew mentioned in the initial Deepwater Supply Inc., we did not submit financial form. Deepwater Supply Inc. has no revenue. It only has expenses. So
That's not quite my question. Did you submit any financials?
we did not.
Okay. Did you submit an appraisal for 2022?
Do you mean like an individual asset appraisal?
Did you submit any appraisal to the assessor for
Mm.
2022?
No, we didn't submit an
I
appraisal.
look at, taxpayer exhibit, page 37.
Mhm.
And tell me when you get to that document.
$37?
Okay, above the table, there's some text. You see that?
Mhm.
Can you read that text?
Yep, it says in support of a request for obsolescence, taxpayers request a third-party appraisal. Once the appraisal is complete, the taxpayer will supplement or revise this return at a later date with additional support for fair market value of the assets.
Okay, you requested, did you ever receive a third-party appraisal?
We do not have a third-party appraisal.
Did you ever receive
No,
a third-party appraisal? And you certainly did not submit one
No.
to the
Mhm.
assessor.
we did not do appraisals on individual assets.
Sir, I'm asking you very simple questions. The statement says that the taxpayers requested a third-party appraisal.
Mhm.
Is that statement accurate? Was a third party appraisal?
We did not request
requested?
a third-party appraisal at
So that
individual
statement was
asset
not
level.
correct in
No.
in the representation that was filed, I assume, by Kroll.
Okay, no, not correct.
Okay.
Mhm.
There's been a lot of talk in twenty
Can I ask a
twenty.
question?
No, you may not.
All
You'll have
right.
a chance to later,
Okay.
but you don't get.
All
to
right,
ask me
not now.
questions,
Okay.
Just the witness.
Mhm.
Here's what I'm struggling with.
Mhm.
In 2020, you provided not only the financial information for Transocean,
Mhm.
but also an appraisal. The assessor gave no obsolescence reduction.
Mhm.
And that determination was upheld by the tax commission. In 2022, you provided less information, and the assessor gave you a 20% obsolescence reduction. Can you explain to me in your own words what warrants a different result?
Well, we did submit an appraisal last time you were all present. And again, you didn't like any, I mean, the appraisal was never really considered as sort of my opinion. But that's just my opinion. So we tried to keep it simple this time. And provide some different information than we provided last time in hopes that it would be considered.
Well, you say some different information.
Yep.
You did provide the Transocean financials to both the assessor and the tax commission in 2020. did you
Yeah, it was
not?
one piece. Yeah.
So what's different?
We provided all the stuff that we've been reviewing through today. So,
Okay.
Mhm.
In your testimony earlier, you spent a lot of time talking about the value of rigs,
Mhm.
the value of drill ships, the value of semi-submersibles, the operating cost of a rig, the day rate of rigs, and what a rig earns. Are there any rigs listed on the assessment in Lafourche Parish that you are challenging?
the rig itself, no, but the equipment that belongs to the rig, yes.
Are there any drill ships
Mhm.
listed on the assessment in Lafourche Parish that you're challenging?
I don't think a drill ship can go on land, sir.
Well, sir, that's not my question. You talked about the value of a drill ship.
Yes.
Are there any drill ships
No, there are not.
located on the assessment?
Mhm.
What about semi-submersibles? Are there any semi-submersibles
Nope.
listed on the assessment?
Sorry.
What is listed
Mhm.
on the assessment?
That there's no drill ships or semi-submersibles on it?
No, I said, what is listed on the
The
assessment?
equipment that belongs to the rigs.
Specifically, it's risers, correct?
Marine drilling riser and drill pipe. Yeah, we talked about that.
Risers and drill pipe.
Mhm.
Okay, you had presented
Mhm.
a few moments ago, I'm trying to find the page, I think it was 20.
Mhm.
Let's go to page 26 in your taxpayer exhibits.
Mhm.
You spent a lot of time talking about these average sale prices.
Mhm.
Now, looking through this list, I see things like flex joint diverters, blowout preventers, crane cabs, rotary tables, gate valves, and hydraulic pumps.
Yes.
Let's, are there any flex joint diverters
In Lafourche?
in Lafourche Parish?
No. So this
Blowout
represents, let me explain this one. So
Hold on, listen,
okay.
you'll get a chance to.
All right.
elaborate in a moment, sir.
ask your
This-
questions.
What about blowout preventers? Are there any blowout preventers
Nope.
on the assessment?
Mhm.
Crane cabs,
Nope,
rotary tables,
nope.
gate valves.
We only have riser and drill pipe in Lafourche.
Okay, now,
Mhm.
the list on page 26 and 27,
But is there drill pipe on the list? Yes.
where?
On the sales? Yeah.
Drill pipe and or risers. Okay. Well, actually, drill pipe and risers.
Mhm.
I want to go through each of them separately.
Okay, so line 35 on 2020, is it 2019, excuse me, sale of E-Class riser.
You have to repeat yourself and talk closer.
Sorry,
to the
line
mic.
30, I can barely read this. Sorry, my eyes are not that good. But line 35 on 2019 sale is sale of E-Class riser. Okay,
Tell me about that riser sale.
okay. So we sold riser to a third party, certain joints of it. I don't know how, it should say how many joints we sold. And it should show you the original cost versus what we sold it for. And who the buyer was. Chet Morrison's the buyer.
Okay, in the 2020 hearing, there was a lot of testimony about how a lot of the risers were in fact scrap.
Mhm.
Was this a scrap riser?
This is probably one that I can't say for sure, but probably one that would not be repurposed immediately for drilling units. So it could be scrap. I don't know if they cut it up. Chet Morrison does operate a riser yard in Terrebonne Parish.
Okay.
So what they did with it, I would have to check.
Is there any more drill pipe or riser listings?
Yep, there's another one, 2020 sale of E-Class riser. Number 2. There's, I'd have to, like I said, I can barely read this, so I'm trying to see, but I know we sold both drill pipe and riser. So, I need to pull up a spreadsheet and search for it.
Well, those are the only two I found.
Okay, so if we sold drill pipe, then it was gonna be sold at scrap value too, so most people wouldn't repurpose drill pipe.
Okay, so, just as, line 35 under 2019, the sale of E-Class riser in
Yeah.
2020, number 2, that would have been scrapped? You know,
Um,
it could be repurposed?
Yeah,
Oh, I'm
pot,
sorry,
yeah,
riser that could be
yeah,
repurposed?
it, I don't know, it could have been repurposed if there's a buyer, if not scrap, I'd have to see where it ended up. So.
Now, are the risers that appear on the asset listing, the Deepwater Marine filed with the assessor, and that appear on the assessment itself, are they scrapped?
Well, if they, yeah, no, they're not scrap, which is why I've held on to them.
Okay. 1 second, please. Thank you. I have no further wait, actually, I do. Mr. Caddington, there was some testimony earlier about a December meeting with the assessor. Did you attend that?
I was not at that meeting.
Who did? Do you know?
Andrew was,
Mr. Hall? Okay. Mr. Hall? You testified earlier that you met with the assessor in December of 2022 to discuss this assessment.
November, December. Yes, it was.
Okay, so that was after you received the tax bill? Did-
Well, it'd be right in that time frame.
Okay. Did you meet with the assessor to discuss the assessment prior to her completing the assessment? Open books period?
Yes, so, yes, we met, we discussed, the appeal, I believe I spoke with Mr. Freelander at that point, just to hear that.
And roughly when? I'm just trying to get a time.
It would be August timeframe, with it, before the,
Before the board of review?
yes.
And tell me about your discussions in August.
It was to go over certain pieces of this information that we'd had, prepared, and it was, similar discussions to what we've had today.
Okay, and which, you said this information, can you show me which of this information?
It would be a significant portion of these reviews. I don't have a comparison of exactly what was done between the two, but it would be a very significant portion of these reviews.
Thank you. No further questions.
All right, are there any questions? Any more questions? All right, well, let's hear from the assessor's office.
Board Chairman, I'd like to call, he's already been sworn in, Mr. Ryan Friedlander. First, Mr. Friedlander, can you state your name and position for the record?
Ryan Freelander, Deputy Assessor, Lafourche Parish Assessor's Office.
And you were the staff member responsible for reviewing Deepwater Supply Inc.'s returns and coming up with the valuation, were you not?
Correct. I was the one who worked the account.
And I think the testimony has been pretty clear about what was filed, but I want to start by clarifying that the only equipment that was reported to your office and appears on this rendition is risers and associated drill pipe, correct?
Yes, that would be correct. That would be an accurate description of the lion's share of the assets that were there in January.
And to be clear, you didn't assess any rigs, drill ships, or semi-submersibles, did you?
No, I did not.
And again, the list I went through a moment, you didn't assess any flex joint diverters, blowout preventers, crane cabs, rotary tables, gate valves, hydraulic pumps, or any of the classes of property other than the two scrap risers listed on pages 26 and 27 of the taxpayers exhibits, did you?
Correct.
Now, there was some discussion about, actually, I want to back up, just to confirm. Mr. Keddington acknowledged that the information they submitted to you was financials, more specifically 10Ks for Transocean, the parent of Deepwater Supply Inc. And apparently Deepwater Supply Inc. is just one of, I think he said 1,000 subsidiaries of Transocean. Did you receive any financial records for Deepwater Supply Inc.?
No, it was strictly for the parent company, Transocean.
And there was a suggestion that that in valuing this type of property, you need to look at the income. Were you provided the information necessary to do an income appraisal of Deepwater Supply Inc.?
I would say the only thing we did from an income perspective was take the contract drilling revenue from the annual 10K. To say that we had utilization as far as financials as this piece of equipment made this much money in 20 and 21. We did not have that year by year comparison to know which each individual piece of equipment made from a revenue perspective or a similar type of asset.
And what about a market approach? Were you provided meaningful comps for the sales price of, again, risers or drill stem that would have allowed you to do a market approach valuation?
No, our office was not providing an independent appraisal specific to the assets relative to this hearing.
And again, it was represented to you that an appraisal would be provided in 2022 as it was in 2020, correct?
That's what, when I was speaking to a few different people, that's the request that was made. The discussion had gotten to that point where we did take into consideration everything that was given. We were very transparent at what our office's procedure is to look at the prior 2 years, which would have been looking at, since we're working 22, we're looking at 21 and 20. And from that point, we felt a conversation had taken place that in order for us to proceed with considering fair market value, we would need to receive an independent appraisal specific to the assets that were located in the Port Fourchon yard and have some actual comps, similar to when somebody will submit a real estate appraisal. There are comps.
And you did receive such an appraisal in 2020, did you not?
We received it, but we did not have a lot of detail showing actual sales transactions.
We don't understand, and we're not here to talk about the 2020, just as a point of reference. Now, taxpayer exhibit 27, and I won't have you read it because I did a few moments ago, but this is correspondence that was submitted to your office, was it not?
Yes, that's what we received.
And it says, in support of a request for obsolescence, the taxpayers requested a third-party appraisal. Once the appraisal is complete, the taxpayer will supplement or revise this return with additional support for fair market values of the assets. Again, just to be clear, you never received an appraisal for 2022, did you?
No, I did not.
Okay. So earlier we talked about 2020. You received an appraisal and also the same 10K information, again, for Transocean, not Deepwater Supply or at the time Resource Rig. And your office granted no obsolescence reduction. Is that correct? Again, 2020.
Correct. No obsolescence.
So in 2022, all you received were the financials, again, 10K excerpts for Transocean, again, the parent. Did you grant an obsolescence reduction in 2022?
Yes, for 2022, Assessor Thibodeau approved a 20% economic obsolescence reduction.
And can you tell me how that 20% obsolescence reduction that again was granted was calculated?
So for that instance, we took the revenue from 2020, which was roughly 3.1 billion, and in 21 it was 2.5 billion from the 10Ks. Considering that and the reduction, we felt that a 20% economic obsolescence reduction was appropriate. Not to mention that in years past, Sessa Thibodeau was very receptive to when I approached her. We were using a 10-year useful life, as you can see in the regulations. She was very receptive, like I said, and we went down to an 8-year useful life because of the harsh conditions of the Gulf of Mexico, the equipment getting transported back and forth. So we felt an 8-year useful life was well within the latitude that Assessor Thibodeau had. So I'd like to point that out, that right off the top, we most likely would have been using a 10-year useful life. So that's a 20% reduction.
From 10 to 8 happened when?
That happened several years ago. This was not something that happened recent. And I just wanted to point that out, that if we would have not done that, we would be at 10 years and not 8.
I mean, I recall that in our
Right.
2020 hearing.
I would say that probably took effect probably in 18 or 19 at the latest, but definitely before 20.
Well, could you elaborate on that briefly? What does going from a 10-year economic life to an 8-year economic life, what is the impact on the values entered by your office?
So what will happen for a 10-year useful life, it's going to take obviously 2 more years to get to the floor for depreciation. It's going to maintain a higher fair market value in the first few years, and then, you know, it'll kind of even out as you get closer to the floor. But it'll become fully depreciated at 8 years as opposed to 10.
And given the discussion that a lot of this equipment was acquired in 2014, this would have, can you quantify, again, assuming that most of this property, as the testimony indicates, was acquired in 2014, does that, earlier you referenced an almost 20% savings?
It may not be equating to that, but the point of it is that the years that the assets would have been newer, the depreciation factor would have been higher, resulting in a higher fair market value. So, you know, in essence, you know, they did receive, or any company for that matter, who has similar type of equipment where it does work over the GOM, they are benefiting from that 8-year useful life versus the 10.
Well, thank you. I have no further questions. Please answer any questions the commissioners might have for you.
Elaborate again on the 3.1 billion versus the 2.5 billion, and what time period, and I'm assuming that is for total sales?
That would be contract drilling revenue, and it was pulled straight from the 10K. So the 3.1 was from the 2020 10K, and the 2.5 was from the 2021 10K. And we felt years ago when we were looking at how to be transparent and how to answer to the general public, we felt looking at drilling revenue or gross revenue was the most fair way to do this. And that's how we did it. We took the reduction comparing 20 to 21, and we round up from 19% to 20%, and that was awarded to this account.
And when you had your meeting with the taxpayer, was that discussed?
I would just like to point out that I spoke to everyone via telephone. Any meetings that took place in Assessor Thibodeau's office, I was not part of. But I can tell you that anything that was presented to me, either electronically or physically, I looked at thoroughly. I appreciate everything that was submitted and rendered to our office. But you know, when I met individually with Assessor Thibodeau, we went back to what our process is, and that's looking at gross revenue, comparing, it would have been comparing 20 to 21. And we just try to be as transparent as possible. Consistency is something that she prides herself in, and we wanted to be consistent with our application of how we look at granting or not granting economic obsolescence. And that it's really that simple of a process. We look at gross revenue from the prior 2 calendar years.
Real quickly, can you tell me the numbers again for 2020 and 2021?
So 2020 on their 10K, it's 3,152,000,000.
3,152,000,000.
And then on the 21 10K, it's 2,556,000,000.
That's 2,556,000,000.
Yes, sir.
And so and that results in a 20% reduction from 20 to 21.
Yeah, 20, yes,
If I
sir.
divide it-
20% reduction in drilling revenue. So
So take 20% off of the 3.152 minus 20%, I should get 2,556,000.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
That policy's been in place for how long?
That policy, that, the,
The calculation.
that's been in place for probably 8 years, minimum 8 years.
Okay, thank you.
And that, all that income from the 10K, the annual report that we've been discussing is global Transocean because you didn't get the financials of the Deepwater income. Did you request it?
We discussed it over the phone, and when it was communicated to our office that one didn't exist, we felt that we did want to work with Transocean. So when we got to that point where typically we would get deep water stuff and that wasn't available, we thought the fair thing to do would be to accept the parent company's information.
And when you requested that the taxpayers order and pay for a third-party appraisal, is that done with any other taxpayers because I understood that you requested that they give you a third-party appraisal?
What we do in a case where someone's going to ask for something that deviates from what the tax commission will require, because we use chapter 25, we say that is the approach that we use to get our fair market value. That if you want to turn in an appraisal, we don't direct people that they have to, but we say your option is you can spend money to get an appraisal, but we don't mandate that they have to. But in order to present the data that we need to compare, we would need an appraisal submitted, but we never make it a requirement. That's totally at the option of the taxpayer.
Okay, that answers my question. I did want to clear something up that y'all both said. No change in the value on our last ruling because we didn't like the appraisal. That came from each of y'all. And I wanted to point out that there was in our ruling a reduction for assets with no value that were identified because of Mr. Creel's appraisal. So we actually did give credence to some of the appraisal and we did have a reduction.
Do we have any other questions? Do you have any questions for the assessor's office?
We do.
Yeah, so
Talk close to the microphone, please.
So you've made an issue about not receiving financials for Deepwater Supply Inc., but Deepwater Supply Inc. has no revenue. How would you have calculated an obsolescence factor for a company with no revenue?
That was exactly our point.
Yeah.
They do own assets that generate revenue, and Assessor Tibbet and I met to discuss that. So since the equipment is owned by Deepwater and you couldn't provide a financial statement, we knew that some entity is collecting those invoices from the customer. So since we couldn't get financials specifically for Deepwater, we felt the next thing to do was to request Transocean's financials. And Bethany and I, who was a colleague of Mr. Kennington, discussed this on the phone. And she's the one who said, Deepwater does report the assets, but you would have to use Transocean's 10K. So at that point, I went to Assessor to go to that information, and she was fine with it.
So why do you feel like revenue is your best measure of judgment for what your obsolescence is? You've got all the different metrics on the P&L down to operating income, net income.
Right.
We're talking about valuation as an income approach.
We felt for the purpose of how Assessor Thibodeau wanted to run our office, we went through a bunch of different scenarios. We felt that gross revenue was the most appropriate thing to do. We feel some of the things that a company could do below that line would not truly indicate the profitability of a company. Some people are good at hiding expenses and not being forthcoming. So we felt the most pragmatic approach would be to do contract drilling revenue and be transparent with the general public, because anytime that we do grant economic obsolescence, not only are we answering to you guys, the general public, but all the different boards that collect the millage, they're losing money when we grant an obsolescence request. So we are also accountable to them. So we needed to have something that was transparent, that made sense. I understand where Mr. Kennington's going with this, but that was a call Assessor Thibodeau made years ago based on conversations she had with myself and some other people, and that's the process she established.
Yeah, I just struggle with the representation that revenue is somehow a measure of your income. When you're talking about valuation metrics, income is a reportable line audited by a public company on an SEC filing. And you can see that all these are negative and have been for several years. So, I struggle with the use of the revenue as a justification for not considering more obsolescence.
Whose policy is it for just the prior to your review? Is that Lafourche Parish policy, or is that a state policy, or is there valuation guidelines that direct you to do that? Whose policy is that, just to use 2 years?
Wendy Thibodeau, the assessor of Lafourche Parish, she felt that that was what she wanted to do when we had this conversation years ago, because you really are looking at equipment that was there on January 1st of 2022. And even though it might not be making revenue at that point, Craig Weber is the sheriff of Lafourche Parish, so his deputies are patrolling to make sure that equipment's safe. The Greater Lafourche Port Commission is also doing that. And Fire District 3 is also making sure that if any of the equipment would get set on fire, that property, that would happen. So we have a lot of people that are involved with an economic obsolescence request. So we feel that even though that equipment wasn't generating any revenue, it was there on January 1st of 2022. And we feel going back 2 years is fair enough. You go back further than that, we feel that, yeah, it might be indicative of the market over that period of time, but at some point you have to set a boundary.
So you said it was Assessor Thibodeau's policy?
Solely her policy. She's the elected official. She set the policy. She didn't get any pressure from anyone else. This was solely her decision based on a meeting she had with various staff members.
So there's not a state guideline or a evaluation guideline that direct her to that?
I'm not aware of anything that would have required her to do that. This was just her own purview.
Do you know why she would not be here to testify if this is a big portion of a difference in agreement on this? Why, if it was her sole discretion and her sole decision, and so now we don't have an understanding because she's not here to testify or support that decision on 20%. That seems to be a big portion of the case.
Wait a second, what's a big portion of the case? Mr. Friedlander testified that he worked this assessment, that he came up with a calculation of 20%. Are you questioning
That's not what he said. He said that Mrs. Assessor Thibodeau is her decision to go with 20%. That's what he stated in her policy, her guidelines. So he stated that she made the determination to go with 20%. And so that's what we're questioning is why do we not have the opportunity to understand where the base is at 20%? Why is there other metrics that should come into account? Does she consider other metrics for other taxpayers? Is the 20% just solely based on deep water supply? And that can't be answered now with her not willing to or not being able to testify on how her policy came about for the 20%. So we're asking,
well, again, Mr. Friedlander stated that he calculated the obsolescence. He presented to Assessor Thibodeau, but he calculated. You can direct any questions about how he calculated that reduction. I think he's already answered it, but feel free to direct any of those questions about how the 20% obsolescence in this case was calculated to Mr. Friedlander.
Okay. Why were just 2 years considered? Why were additional years not considered in the calculation? My understanding is your calculation was the contract drilling revenue divided by 2 years to come up with a 19% reduction to 20%. Why were additional years not considered other than a policy that had been put in place by assessor's office?
So I'll point this out. On December 13th of 2022, he had a meeting with Assessor Thibodeau that I was not a part of. And she assured me she answered all of these questions in detail. She explained why we do what we do. I think that probably this question got answered in that meeting. I can tell you the discussions I've had with her, she felt it was fair to use a 2-year period because you're showing what you made the prior 2 years. I think that she has the latitude to establish that 2-year period. And that's the decision that she made. But I think that when you posed all these questions to her at that meeting on December 13th of 2022, a lot of these questions were addressed and answered.
During the meeting, that I had with Assessor Thibodeau, the reason was being consistent with the 20%, or the calculation was being consistent with other taxpayers in the jurisdiction, and that was the answer was provided to me. Does being consistent with other taxpayers make this valuation true fair market value?
We don't do anybody any political favors, if that's what the insinuation is that we base our Lat 5 returns based on the honor system of what is rendered. We work it up based on the Louisiana Tax Commission's guidelines in Chapter 25. That's how we work this account and every other account. And the only time that obsolescence is requested is on a case like this. We have very few cases that I work where economic obsolescence is requested. It has to be requested, it has to be in writing, and adequate information has to be presented to me or other members of the Business Personal Property Department, where we then go to Assessor Thibodeau with what we have, and we say, you know, this is what they qualify for and what they don't qualify for. And for everything that I have ever been a part of in my 10+ years of being there, we've always compared the prior 2 years of revenue. She's never deviated from that. She's always been transparent and consistent.
We are here presenting the case. Nobody is asking for political favors. All this information is available publicly, and that's how we put the information together. But again, the question is being consistent on a 2-year look back and saying that's what we apply to all taxpayers. Does that mean that this is a fair market value applied to this property? Those two are not mutual. They're not necessarily together. They can be certainly different, where you can treat a taxpayer, all taxpayers the same with a calculation, but it does not necessarily mean that the fair market value for this equipment is being properly identified because you're following a consistent calculation. It also doesn't mean that the calculation of the 20% is in line with any valuation standards or state policies or any of that. So that's where we're trying to understand is, does it take into account a calculation that you apply for all different taxpayers mean that it's a fair market value for this property?
Yes, we use the tax commission's guidelines. That's what we're mandated to do. And anytime somebody wants to bring in the cost approach, that's when we say, we don't require it, but we say in order to do that, we need independent third-party appraisal done that has comps, that has sales data that we can look at. And independent of absent of that, we have to follow what the tax commission requires us to do. If we don't have the information to make a credible reduction, we follow Chapter 25.
Is this calculation of the prior 2 years, is that in the state's guidelines?
That is something that's within Assessor Thibodeau's authority, and she has established that. And I mean, it's really that simple. She established it.
What I'm hearing, let me kind of interject something. I mean, from what I'm hearing, both of y'all are correct in one way. All right, y'all agree on the starting point, right?
Correct.
And we agree on the depreciation methodology, right? There's not a disagreement there. So what we're really talking about is an obsolescence factor.
Correct.
And how we're going to get to that obsolescence factor, and both parties agree to it. The information that you've given us may not get you there. The information that the assessor's using sounds to me that they're consistent. They may not be using the same information that you would like them to use to get to the obsolescence factor. So the taxpayer has to provide the information to the assessor, challenging the assessor's methodology and the end result. So you need to argue that what you've provided here does that.
So, Mr. Friedlander, did you send an email to Andrew saying that you could do nothing more than 20%?
I sent an email saying I didn't bring my laptop with me, but based on the data that he gave me and what Assessor Thibodeau requires, 20% is the best we could do. absent of an independent appraisal. And I reiterated that many times.
Okay, I don't think
and
that's what the email said. I don't think it had any reference to an independent appraisal.
I said that to Bethany over the phone
Okay.
and that we made that clear to you guys
Mhm.
years ago that if y'all did want economic obsolescence,
Mhm.
we'd have to have an independent appraisal done
Mhm.
with sales comps.
Okay, so
You brought up Terrebonne Parish earlier. Okay, you have, drill pipe and risers in Terrebonne Parish?
we do, Trent Morrison has a riser yard in Terrebonne Parish, so we have risers stored in Terrebonne.
And is the same information given to the assessor in Terrebonne Parish that is given to the assessor in Lafourche Parish?
Well, it's in a federal trade zone, so it doesn't really
Mhm.
matter.
Okay, so there's no need to argue
If
the,
requested, yeah, we can, yeah, but we haven't had those discussions with Terrebonne.
Couple of additional questions that may
Wait,
kind
can
of
we-
clear this.
I still have a
I
couple more.
think you still had a
Okay,
question.
so-
I interrupted him.
So you did, I was gonna, yeah, no, that's fine. I just wanted, I think you clarified it, but you did request an appraisal.
We don't request it. We say in order for you to get a reduction. So on page 37, it says in support of a request for
Okay,
obsolescence.
that was from us, but did you,
Right.
you didn't request it, right?
We don't demand that.
Okay.
We communicate to you guys what you can submit,
Okay.
but we don't have the authority to
And
demand.
when we
that.
submitted it in 2020, did you consider, it or did it get discarded?
No, we absolutely looked at it. Assessor Thibodeau and I spent a thorough amount of time
Mhm.
combing through it, and we requested for Mr. Creel to actually give some substance to it
Mhm.
and see actual sales data. We didn't receive that.
Are there any other questions from anyone?
Yeah,
You
I
look
do
like-
have
yeah.
some quick redirect that I think may help clear this up. Mr. Friedlander, there's been a lot of discussion about, a suggestion, I'll put it that way, that you should have used a longer period of calculating your obsolescence. Now, again, you granted a 20% obsolescence reduction in 2022 based upon the reduction from 2020 to 2021, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Let's run that back 5 years. What were the reported revenues in 2017?
So in 17, it was 2.7 billion.
2018,
It was just north of 3 billion.
2000, tell you what, no, give me let's go back to 7. Can you give me the full number?
So in 17, it was 2,731,000,000. In 18, it was 3,018,000,000. In 19, it was
Okay,
3
whoa,
billion. I'm
I
sorry.
can't write as fast as you can talk. Let's,
I think this is on his page 24, maybe?
I think you're making the point that they're all over 2.5 billion.
Well, the point is that revenues were increasing until the last year, and had he done a 5-year average, then the obsolescence reduction would have been even less. That in fact, 2 years was the most advantageous under the calculations they're proposing.
Your assumption here, an implicit assumption, is that revenue is a good indicator of income and value, and it's not. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, that was my sole regret.
not a problem. All right, any other questions from the commissioners?
And
All right, well, think,
that,
okay,
well, that's false. If we're taking a look into the prior average of the prior 5 years, the average is greater than the 3.152, because I mean, you get it back into 2015, it's 6.8, and so then your starting number, that average is higher compared to the actual for 2021, so the obsolescence would be higher. So your statement just proves our point, what we're looking at, that if we're taking to a look at what the amounts were in a greater time period on average compared to just this one prior year, then the obsolescence would be greater. So then the question becomes, what if in this next year we do $1 more? $1 more in drilling revenue by this, we get 0 obsolescence, yet we're still down at historic lows. So that's where that's flawed, and we take a look at just taking a look at 2 years. If we did $1 more in revenue, there would be no obsolescence. But the equipment's still doing the exact same,
But if we compare it to the greater review, a greater broadened look, the obsolescence, is apparent in again, when the equipment was purchased, that's whenever, what was the expected return and versus what is it getting now? So, I think his statement right there is, it proves our position. The average, if you take the prior 5 years, is greater. And then the delta is versus what was in 2021.
Actually, you can run the numbers yourself. That's factually inaccurate. Actually, the 5-year average is significantly lower. The 6-year average is lower. You have to go back 7 years till you start getting any difference. And you have to go back 8 years before there's a significant difference. At a certain point, how far back do you go?
Again, I think it all just, we made these points early on, so I'm not gonna argue the revenue argument. I don't think it's a good argument, but you have to overlay that with what the day rates are. There's a day rate chart in here and you can see where day rates collapse and then where they recover. And the part where your day rates are high is when you're making money, you have good income. And when they collapse, which is 2016, you're in a downturn, and that's what led companies to be bankrupt. So again, I'm not gonna argue that revenue makes any sense. You have to look at income. But you have been in a projected downturn.
And again, no income data was provided for Deepwater Supply. Thank you, commissioners.
All right, I believe that concludes all the questions and statements. I believe this matter is far more complicated than trying to make a decision today. So for that reason, I am making the motion that in the appeal of Deepwater Supply Incorporated versus Assessor Wendy Thibodeau and Lafourche Parish Board of Review, docket number 22-22057-025 be taken under advisement by the commission. Is there any objection to that motion? There being no objection to the motion stands adopted.
So we don't have to be back tomorrow for a second day of hearing.
No, we're not coming back. All righty. Well, thank you all very much for the
Thank you,
presentation.
commissioners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I believe that concludes our docket for today. Therefore, I will accept a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chairman, I move
Yes.
for adjournment.
We have a motion to adjourn. Is there any objection to the motion? There being no objection to the motion stands adopted. We stand adjourned at 11:47 a.m.